Hi everyone. So today we're talking about the second ethical theory of three in our ethics section of the course, where this second ethical theory that we're talking about today is this thing called deontology. So throughout today's lecture, I'm going to try to contrast deontology to utilitarianism, as the two are often seen to be in direct conflict in that they recommend very different courses of action in figuring out what kinds of things are the morally best things to do in any given circumstance. So, deontology, what is it that we mean when we say deontology? Essentially, deontology just means, it's a confusing sounding word, but all we mean by that is something like duty-based ethics. So deontology, I believe, is derived from Latin and just breaks down to mean ethics that we base on the generation of duties, so things that we have a duty always to do. This is a kind of ethical theory then that's going to generate rules, absolute rules, rules to things that are always morally good to do and things that are always morally bad to do. And those rules are going to have corresponding obligations. So if one of our ethical rules, a very common one that we all seem to agree on, is something like it's ethically wrong to kill, it's ethically wrong to steal, right? So then we have obligations not to do those things. We have duties not to do those things. So there are lots of different kinds of duty-based ethics we can come up with. So different traditions, different cultures, different thinkers have come up with different ways of formulating the particular ethical rules we should follow. So if you think about it, most religions have some kind of set of rules and duties that they think are the things that are ethically right. But the thing that we'll look at in this class, and the reading that I assigned, is looking at the kind of deontology that's associated with Immanuel Kant, who's a German philosopher, a very influential German philosopher writing in the 18th century. Deontology involves principles rather than what utilitarianism doesn't involve principles. It doesn't involve looking at the kinds of things that are always right or always wrong to do. Because utilitarianism focuses on consequences above all else, it means that the kind of thing that's right to do or wrong to do is going to depend on the outcome of doing those things. So a certain action could be wrong in one case and right in the next. So this you saw in your very good reading responses, in which I asked when the utilitarian would think it's okay to lie and when they'd think it's wrong to lie. And essentially, the utilitarian is going to say something like, it's not wrong to lie as long as your lie will lead to a positive outcome, and vice versa. So the kinds of examples you guys gave, things like, if you're a spy for your country, then usually it's okay to tell lies to your friend about your profession, about the activities going on, because if you tell him that you're a spy, that will increase the risk for both of you. It might lead to great political fallout, and so on. So this kind of lie is justified because of the outcomes that would occur if you didn't lie. Lots of you use white lies as an example, so you said things like, look, it's fine to lie to your friend. If they ask if their hat looks ridiculous, you think it does look ridiculous, but for the utilitarian, you should lie and say that the hat looks great because otherwise you'll hurt your friend's feelings, the outcomes will be worse. So deontology, in contrast to this, is focusing on actions and looking at which kinds of actions are good generally and which kinds of actions are bad generally. So for deontology, it's just always morally bad to lie, regardless of the consequences. So as I've put in the middle bullet point, deontology is the kind of thing that's going to generate absolute rules like you should not lie, you should not break promises, and so on. So to demonstrate this a little bit more concretely, if you look at the question, should Batman kill his archenemy, the fairly evil, fairly wrongdoing Joker, then utilitarianism in this case is going to say yes, because utilitarianism is going to say something like, look, the Joker is a bad guy, will kill lots of innocent people if you don't kill him. That's what's going on in the little excerpt of the comic that I've included in the slide, right? That's the Joker saying that if he's not killed, then of course he's going to go on and kill more innocent people, do more harm in the world. So for the utilitarian, it's bad that some suffering is caused in the sense that one life is lost if Batman kills the Joker, but you're preventing the Joker from harming many, many other people. So, of course, for the utilitarian, that's the ethical thing to do. The deontologist is going to disagree and say that, of course, Batman shouldn't kill the Joker because killing is wrong. Like, killing is just wrong. Killing is always wrong, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the context, regardless of the potential bad outcomes. And people will have these kinds of conversations too about things like torture, right? Some people will just say, look, torture is always wrong, regardless of the outcomes. And other people will say things like, look, if it's the case that torture does sometimes generate good results, side note, I think the empirical evidence very much shows that torture doesn't generate good results. But the utilitarian would say, look, if it could be shown that sometimes torture does generate good results, then it's justifiable. And this kind of conflict, right? These different answers that these different ethical theories give, that's what's going on in the Ursula Le Guin reading from last week too. So the reason that that story provides a critique of utilitarianism is from a deontological angle. You can say something like, look, it's just bad that that small child is being kept in that room suffering, regardless of the fact that that means the rest of the city can be happy. Like, it's unjust, it's unfair. That kind of action is just wrong, and utilitarianism doesn't account for that. That's what the deontologist would say. Okay, so the rest of this lecture then is really going to be me unpacking Kant's particular brand of deontology, his particular way of generating action-based ethics, or ethics that looks at which kinds of actions are wrong or right. There are two steps in which we'll do that. The first step is this, looking at this idea of treating people as ends rather than as mere means. And that's the idea that you get from the Honora O'Neill article that I assigned for this week. And then the second thing we'll look at is something called the categorical imperative, which is Kant's particular way of generating which kinds of rules we should be following. Okay, so first, what does this mean, saying that we should be treating people as ends rather than mere means, and why does Kant object to treating people as mere means? So the quote I've included from Kant is, he says you should act in such a way that you should always treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So what he's saying here is something like, you should always treat people as ends in themselves. So you should always treat people such that you're recognizing their full humanity, such that you're recognizing their desires, their hopes, what they want to be doing. Now the thing we really need to think about is what it is to treat somebody as a mere means and why he objects to this so much. So I think all of us have an intuitive sense of what it is to treat somebody as a means to an end. If you're treating somebody as a means to an end, it means that instead of just interacting with them on a human basis, you're interacting with them in such a way that you want something out of them, right? So that's the end. You want an end that isn't just having this conversation with them. All the time, though, it seems like we are treating people as means rather than ends, or it seems like there are lots and lots of circumstances in which we're interacting with others and we want something other than just having that conversation. We want something out of that. But it seems like sometimes we think that's acceptable and sometimes we think it's problematic. And what we need to do now is be able to draw that line between those two things so we can figure out what it is to treat someone as a mere means rather than just a means. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, so why do we sometimes think that treating people as a means is acceptable and sometimes not? I've included some examples of cases where we treat people as means to an end, but where we think that that's okay. So starting with the bottom bullet point there is probably the least controversial, right? So that's the idea that in retail, right, in navigating the world, all the time we treat people as a means to an end. So if you go into a deli and you order a bagel, your interaction with the guy behind the till, you're treating him as a means to an end, where the end is you getting a delicious bagel, because you're not engaging with the conversation and just treating him as an end where what you want from that conversation is to be having a conversation with that guy. You're just treating him as a way to get to the food that you want to eat. So in the cases above, so surrogacy, We think that at least when it's legally done and with good provisions and safeguards, surrogacy is a perfectly legitimate, ethically fine thing to do, right? So if someone's infertile, say, and they choose to get a surrogate in order to have a child, we think that that's okay, even though they're using that surrogate, that woman, as a means to an end, where that end is getting a baby. The same with human test subjects. We're using those science is using those people as means to an end, where the end is figuring out if this medicine works, right? Figuring out whether their research is accurate. But again, as long as that's done in the right conditions, we think that that's okay. So where then does it become a problem? When do we think that treating someone as a means to an end is a bad thing? So colloquially, in our contemporary parlance, essentially when it's a problem to treat someone as a means to an end is when you're, in a sense, using that person, right? So that's a thing that people will say in the world. People will say as a complaint, he really mistreated me, it really felt like he was using me. And that's a very pejorative thing to say there. That's where someone is being used as a mere means rather than just a means. And if you look at the middle bullet point here, essentially where the problem lies, the way we're going to define this is saying to use somebody as a mere means is to involve them in something that they could not in principle consent to, and then therefore, in a sense, to turn them into a tool. So we think that it's problematic to treat someone as a mere means to an end when they don't know that they're being used to produce that end, right? So the deli case is fine because the guy behind the counter very much knows that the reason that you're talking to him, interacting with him, is in order to get the bagel. He's very much involved in that process. He wants to take your money in order to give you that bagel. All of that seems fine. Cases that are problematic would be if you took one of the cases from before, like the human test subjects case. That's fine in a scientific context in which everything's being done legally. But if you're conducting tests on people and you're not telling them that you're conducting tests on them, that then is very ethically bad because they haven't consented to being involved in that kind of thing, right? So we think, to give another example, if you have a friend and your friend has a really rich parent who works in a big company that you'd like to work in, if the only reason that you're friends with that person, the only reason you have conversations with them is in order to try and get to that father figure and to try and get a job in that company, then if you haven't told that person that that's what you're doing, which presumably you haven't, then that's problematic. We think that's ethically bad because you're using them as a mere means. You're using them, right? You are deceiving them, you're coercing them in a sense into being involved in that thing. So the last bullet point I've put, for Kant, there's this big emphasis on human beings having intrinsic worth and dignity, and the things that are going to turn out to be ethically wrong for him, cases in which you're treating people as ends, as mere means rather than as ends, are cases in which you aren't respecting the intrinsic dignity of people. You aren't respecting people and their free will and their capacity to move around the world freely. Okay, so on to the second facet of Kant's theory that we're going to talk about, and this is something called the categorical imperative. That title doesn't matter. Like, it won't be clear to you why it's called that. That is okay. But essentially, what's important here, what we're looking at here, is we're looking at Kant's particular way of figuring out how we generate the absolute rules that we ought to follow. So that is the quote I've put here. His way of figuring out which actions are morally good and which actions are morally bad is he says something like, you should act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That in and of itself is going to seem a bit confusing, but instead of reading the word maxim here, you could just substitute that with the word intention, right? Or your attitude. So Kant cares about your intentions behind acting. And essentially what he wants us to do is he wants us to, anytime you're faced with an ethical scenario, right, and you're thinking about what you ought to do in a given circumstance, he wants us to think about what would happen if you universalized that action such that you would always act in that way or always follow that intention. And then depending on what the result that you get when you universalize that, that's how you can figure out if that kind of action, that kind of intention is ethically good or ethically bad. I think that's still going to seem unclear, so I'm going to go through the two examples at the bottom of the slide, and I hope that those will provide you with clarity. So first, I've got that for Kant we have a duty not to break promises, right? So this is a universal rule that he thinks we should always follow. How does he get there? So we get there by thinking about a scenario. So they say that you're faced with a scenario where you could break a promise and you're trying to figure out whether you ought to break that promise or not. So say you promised your friend that you'd help them move tomorrow at 10 a.m., right? You'd help them move house. You promised that you'd show up, but then something else has come up. That can be trivial or non-trivial, right? So something else has come up and you don't want to show up anymore at 10 a.m. So you're thinking about whether you ought to tell your friend that you can no longer go along, even though you promised them that you would. For Kant, what you do there is you try to universalize that action, right? You try and universalize the maxim that you have there, so the intention that you'd have by doing that thing. So that's something like, look, if I break this promise, I'm breaking this promise because it's inconvenient for me, in this case, to stick to the promise, so to show up tomorrow at 10 a.m. What would happen if I universalize that? So what would happen if everybody, whenever it were inconvenient for them to keep their promise, just broke that promise? If that were the case, two things, right? Like one, that's not a very desirable world, right? Like we don't want to live in a world where everyone just breaks their promises, where it's inconvenient for them, because that seems like it will be a very unhappy world. It seems like then you'll never be able to trust people's promises. And then two, that follows on from one, but even stronger than that, it seems like a problem with universalizing that intention, right? Where that intention's something like, I should break promises when it's more convenient for me to break them. If everybody broke their promises whenever it were convenient for them to do so, promises would cease to be what we recognize them as, right? So promises would cease to be binding. Like if you knew that everybody broke a promise if it were inconvenient for them to stick to the promise, then if someone promises you something, it's no longer going to mean the same kind of thing. So there's a sense in which it's also kind of logically inconsistent to universalize that kind of thing. So therefore, for Kant, he's like, since it doesn't, when we universalize this idea that you could break promises when it's convenient for you, that leads to a bad world, and it means that we then can't make sense of our promise-forming habits anymore. Therefore, breaking promises is not the kind of action that any of us should follow. So the second example I've got then is that we have a duty to help those who are in need. This is a little more straightforward. In that case, you just try and universalize what would happen if you didn't do that. Okay, so in general, this is the thing you do, right, to figure out whether something's the kind of action that you should all be doing or that we should not be doing, is you think about what would happen if everybody in the world acted like that and what would happen if everybody in the world didn't. So if you universalize nobody helping those who are in need, then the kind of world that you get is very undesirable, right? The kind of world that you get is very hostile. Whereas it seems like if you universalize the maxim that you ought to help those who are in need, then that does seem to be the kind of world that we would like to live in, right? So that's the general thought behind coming up with the kinds of rules that Kant cares about. Hopefully you've been able to follow that okay. If it's still a little confusing to you, don't worry too much. Really, the important things to remember about Kant and his deontology are one, He cares about human dignity and respect, so he cares about treating people as ends in themselves, not using them, not deceiving them, and so on. 2, he thinks there are absolute rules, so he thinks that there are things that are just always good to do and always bad to do. This is his way of getting at what those rules are, but really the fundamentally important thing is that he thinks that there are actions that are just always morally right, and there are other actions that are always morally wrong. Okay, so really quickly then, just some of the advantages of deontology. Just it emphasizes the value of every human being, allows us to talk about justice and rights in a way that utilitarianism doesn't. It deals with intentions and motivations, right? So it deals with how we intend to act, the things that we care about. It provides certainty, since some actions are always wrong, whereas utilitarianism arguably is a lot more context dependent, or is a lot more context dependent. So some people criticize it by saying that it doesn't help us enough because in every situation you have to try and calculate the consequences. Sometimes it's difficult to do so, etc. Deontology a lot more clear cut, right? It's a lot more clear cut to say things like it's always wrong to do this, it's always right to do this. It's an easier ethical theory to follow in a sense. Some difficulties: it's a little absolutist because the rules are supposed to apply in all cases. The utilitarian will complain with number 2 here and say that it allows acts with terrible consequences. So in the Batman case, if the Joker says something like, next time I escape, I guarantee that I will kill 10,000 people, it will definitely happen, and the chances of that are relatively high. Deontology technically says that Batman still shouldn't kill the Joker because killing is wrong. The utilitarian will say that that's a problem. 3, it's unclear how to reconcile conflicting duties. So if you've got a rule that's like you should not tell lies, if you've got a rule that says something like you should protect your friends, right? Then in the white lie situation that I already talked about and that's in the little doodle here, it's going to be unclear which rule you ought to prioritize, like which duty should you follow, which thing is more binding. This is a problem for deontology, but arguably this is also a problem for utilitarianism. Like sometimes it will be unclear whether you should prioritize, say, short-term consequences or long-term consequences, right? So I don't think that number 3 is a problem that's particular to deontology. Okay, in sum then, utilitarianism prioritizes consequences, so it says something like the ends justify the means. Deontology prioritizes actions themselves and our intentions in acting, so it says something like the end does not justify the means. Thank you for listening. I hope you've all had a good week, and I hope all of that was clear.